Good morning. The Committee on Natural Resources will now come to order. As you will see, I am sitting in for Chairman Raul Grijalva, who has a death in the family and could not join us this morning. The committee is meeting today to hear testimony on the Department of Interior spending priorities and the President's fiscal year 2021 budget proposal. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chairman and the ranking minority member. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today. Hearing no objection, so ordered. I will now take 5 minutes for my opening statement. Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and thank you to our witness, Assistant Secretary Susan Combs, for appearing at today's oversight hearing on the Interior Department spending priorities and budget proposal for fiscal year 2021. Welcome. I am, however, disappointed that Secretary David Bernhardt is not here today to defend the numerical and moral values embodied in his department's budget. However, I am grateful to Assistant Secretary Combs for agreeing to loan us her experience and expertise. We should be here today to begin the important, historic, and deliberative process of negotiating a budget for the Department of Interior for fiscal year 2021. We are not. This budget is not a serious opening offer. If enacted, the proposed cuts would be devastating. The Trump administration is requesting another dramatic 16% cut for the Department of Interior to its fiscal year 2020 enacted budget. Radical reductions to the Natural Park Services and the Bureau of Land Management land acquisition programs would virtually eliminate a portion of the Land and Water Conservation Fund, a popular bipartisan program that was permanently authorized earlier this Congress. If enacted, these cuts would increase the backlog of maintenance in our nation's parks instead of reducing it. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who frequently speak about the need to reduce the backlog don't support this extreme cut. We're asked to accept the lowest levels of funding when adjusted for inflation for both the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Bureau of Indian Education in nearly 20 years, 2 decades. As if the education of approximately 80,000 Bureau of Indian Education students is not bad enough. We're asking for more cuts towards the education of those children. The budget continues to invest in a reorganization of Interior that prepares this institutional knowledge and experience and leaves it more vulnerable to special interest influence. The proposed relocation of BLM is a good example. Despite repeated requests, this committee has not seen an analysis of the problem that a relocation will solve. We haven't seen a real cost-benefit analysis. There has been no serious examination of potential impacts on taxpayers, employees, and the agency. The implementation of BLM's relocation would be embarrassing to most administrations. In particular, the cuts to climate change action represent the opposite of what we need. Major cuts are proposed to programs at the U.S. Geological Survey that are designed to help the country prepare for and manage the impacts of climate change. They include a 48% cut to a species management research, a 64% cut for climate adaptation science centers, and a 30% cut to the Water Resource Availability Program. In contrast, the Energy and Minerals Program at USGS will see an increase. In fact, the budget is again replete with gifts to the fossil fuel industry. 10 years after the Deepwater Horizon disaster spilled over 200 million gallons of oil into the ocean, the budget is attempting to cut the oil spill research program, and BLM is requesting a 19% increase for its coal management program. For my family, my friends, and my neighbors, dealing with climate change is an act of self-defense. The Northern Mariana Islands and Guam and American Samoa and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are already feeling the impacts with back-to-back typhoons, super typhoons, in fact, shoreline flooding and the dying of our coral reefs. Adapting to the effects of climate change is not a choice for us, but we cannot do it alone, nor should we have to. The people of the Marianas, of the insular areas, did not cause this climate change. The budget proposes cuts totaling more than 20% to all the programs that the U.S.-affiliated insular areas rely on. The cuts will have a devastating effect on areas that are dealing with stagnant or no economic growth, constrained budgets, and the aftermath of catastrophic storms. I have no doubt that the insular delegates will work together to try and fight for level funding or increase in funding of OIA's Technical Assistance Program grants. And then after we succeed, the Assistant Secretary will go out to the different insular areas, hand out checks or collect miles, and act as if it was handing out money from some family estate or something. All of this is happening as a new wave of science is telling us we have significantly underestimated the pace and severity of the climate crisis. The Department of Interior needs to step up, not stand down. Ahead of this hearing, the committee provided Assistant Secretary Combs with some questions that would be asked by several of the committee members here today, with the hopes that she will be able to provide complete and helpful answers. And I look forward to her testimony and answers. Mr. Chairman, this time I yield my 5 minutes I recognize the Ranking Member Bishop for his opening statement.
Thank you. I have a nice snarky opening statement that I'm going to submit for the record instead. One of the things I want to start with here, though, is, even though I could not get hold of him yesterday, is a comment to Chairman Grijalva. We have a great deal of condolences for the situation he is in today. It doesn't matter whether intellectually this is a better situation for his mother or not. You can do those things intellectually, but there's still an emotional bondage that has to take place in the heart, and that just takes time just to get up to the reality of what the situation is. So my heart goes out to Chairman Grijalva. Our prayers are with him as well. I think all of us on the committee want to give him our deepest condolences, and I think that's a somber element to start this. Ms. Combs, I appreciate you being here again. I know the Secretary is tied in all sorts of different directions, but he has repeatedly offered to meet with this committee, either in part or parcel, so I appreciate that. It's been a while since last time I had an opportunity to talk to you. Thank you for coming out to Utah. I really think those horses that we had the picture taken with in Ogden are still prettier than anything you'd find in Grand Junction, but we'll go over that later sometime. I do want to commend the department, though, in a couple of different areas. Number one, there are some high-risk grants that Fish and Wildlife is looking over that have been truly abused to harm people and to violate human rights. And I appreciate the department's effort to go through with that. I know this committee would like to work with Fish and Wildlife to make sure that those abuses will never happen again and there truly is an accounting for where that money goes. I also recognize the department has done some great efforts in trying to eliminate what I simply call as slush funds, even though Congress keeps repopulating that fund as well. I think you're doing a good job to try and coordinate and do that. And I also want to commend this department, if nothing else, on the way you deal with RACs, and I don't know if you call them MACs anymore, but the ability of trying to get local people involved in land management decisions is taken on a resounding increase with this administration. Those efforts of realizing that those people who live next to public lands have to have a say in those. And it's more than just the relocation of BLM to where the lands are. It's with all kinds of lands that are out there in which you have truly engaged local people into advisory committees so that local voices can finally have a say in how those lands are managed. To me, those are very positive trends, and I appreciate the Secretary's effort. I appreciate your effort in those, as well as like the leaders in BLM and the Park Service and Fish and Wildlife, who are involving local citizens more than ever before in those kinds of decisions. So thank you for being here. I don't want to take all this time. I want to yield back, and once again, I would hope our committee can send our deepest and sincerest condolences to the chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bishop. I'd like to introduce our witness. The Honorable Susan Combs is the Assistant Secretary for Policy, Management, and Budget at the Department of the Interior. I thank you very much for taking time to be here today. Under our committee rules, oral statements are limited to 5 minutes, but your entire statement will appear in the hearing record. The lights in front of you will turn yellow when there is 1 minute left, and then red when time is expired. After Assistant Secretary Combs has testified, members will be given the opportunity to ask questions. The chair now recognizes Secretary Combs for her testimony.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Vice Chairman Sablon, Ranking Member Bishop, members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of President Trump's 2021 budget request for the Department of the Interior. My name is Susan Combs. I'm the Assistant Secretary for Policy, Management, and Budget at the Department of the Interior. With your permission, I would like to submit my entire written testimony for the record, and I have a few opening remarks. Before I turn to the budget, I want to discuss President Trump's truly historic statement yesterday. The President has called upon Congress to send him a bill that fully and permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund and restores our national parks. I believe President Trump is the first president to seek mandatory funding for these items. His leadership and support for this unprecedented effort is an extremely significant signal for the cause of conservation. The enactment of such legislation would be a remarkable achievement. I urge each of you to help us get this legislation on the President's desk as soon as possible. I am here to discuss the President's 2021 budget request for Interior. The request totals $12.8 billion and is $245 million above our request last year. We are proud of this ongoing support for the results we deliver for the American people. Our budget meets the administration's overall fiscal objective to keep the U.S. economy thriving through pro-growth policies and spending restraint. Our 65,000-plus employees are dedicated public servants who collectively oversee 1 in 5 acres across the country. We have nearly 9,000 public safety, law enforcement, and wildland fire employees who put their lives on the line every day to protect America's natural resources and ensure the safety of visitors to our public lands, parks, and refuges. Their duties range from backcountry rescues to policing in major city parks and tribal lands and support for federal drug and border protection efforts. The budget supports this important work and includes $3 million to investigate cold cases, missing persons, and violence in Indian country, supporting the work of the President's Task Force on Missing and Murdered Native Americans and Alaska Natives. The 2021 budget ramps up efforts to protect communities from wildland fire devastation. Interior's wildland firefighters are among the American heroes working the front lines, protecting communities and proactively reducing vegetation which fuels fires. Last year, our fire personnel treated more than 1.4 million acres, a 10-year high. The President's budget includes $1 billion for our wildland fire program with an increase of $50 million to transform and strengthen our firefighting workforce. Interior is increasingly reliant on temporary and seasonal firefighters. The budget turns this around by investing in permanent fire positions and longer-term seasonal employees. This will also increase our ability to proactively reduce wildfire risk through active fuels management. In addition, this budget invests in increased broadband access in rural and tribal areas, a more sustainable wild horse and burro management program, U.S. energy and critical minerals independence, expanded public access to interior lands for hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation, conservation stewardship, and reliable water supplies and delivery in the West, and these priorities create economic benefits. This budget invests in ongoing efforts to modernize and transform our administrative operations and better support our important mission. I am privileged to work for the federal government. I feel strongly we must do our best to improve how Interior provides service to the American people. This includes ensuring we have a vital and motivated workforce in the future. Only 8% of Interior's workforce is below the age of 30. To continue to meet our mission, we must make it easier to attract and retain talented people. As chair of Interior's Workplace Culture Transformation Advisory Council, we are working to improve workplace culture, addressing harassment of any kind and building for the future, for example, through career pathing. Ethics is a critical part of a stronger workplace culture. We are implementing Efficiency 2020 to deliver our mission through simpler, smarter, and faster processes. This concludes my remarks. I am pleased to answer any questions you may have about the 2021 budget.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. I'm going to start with, at the beginning of February, without warning or explanation, Department of Interior started producing documents requested by the committee in hard copy instead of electronic files. We immediately asked DOI to produce the documents in their original unaltered form instead of paper form. They refused. They gave no explanation. All productions since then have continued to be in paper. They even bragged about it in their Twitter feed. There. These are not documents that need to be delivered in hard copy. They are records of emails, databases, and other documents that would have been much more easily delivered in their original electronic form. It took extra time and taxpayers' money out of the budget to print them out. This is clearly a tactic DOI is using to slow down committee staff who have to tediously scan every individual page. Just as an example, a recent document production about the BLM relocation included 3,845 pages of charts from an electronic GSA database. That's nearly a third of the entire document production they sent. It's a lot of pages, Madam Secretary. And even if the information in this chart is useful, it is completely unusable when it's printed out like this. There is no way to know what any of these columns mean or which rows align with which. The practice was so egregious. My friends on the other side of the aisle expressed concern in the September hearing with DOI about their obstruction of investigation. At that hearing, Dan Giorgiani, the DOI solicitor, committed to this committee to improving it. And since that promise, DOI gave us the same useless printouts of databases 3 more times. Can you give me, Madam Secretary, any explanation for these tactics other than outright stonewalling? The chair and ranking Republicans sent over a request for the electronic files yesterday. Can you assure me and this committee that we will get electronic copies instead of printouts this time?
Mr. Vice Chair, I have, of course, as you may be aware, I'm not part of the document production. However, I can assure you that I will talk to the Office of Congressional Liaison immediately upon return to the office and relay your request.
Madam Secretary, with all due respect, you're here as a surrogate of Mr. Bernhardt, who has the ability to commit to stonewalling like this. It is disappointing that you are refusing to make that commitment. I'm asking you for a commitment that this will stop. This waste of time, paper, and effort will stop.
I do not have the authority to make that demand, but I will go back and ask this afternoon, and I appreciate your request, and I certainly understand what you have stated, and I have looked at the slides that you were nice enough to show me, and so I will go to the Office of Congressional Liaison and ask them again. Thank you.
All right. I will have to settle with that answer, Madam Secretary. Madam Secretary, something closer to home, the fiscal year 2021 budget for Insular Affairs proposes to insular programs proposes cost by more than 20%. And this unprecedented reduction in funding is striking, especially when the department's budget justification acknowledges that the islands face a number of challenges due to their small, isolated economies. The TAP, which provides small grants to these islands in cases where there is no appropriate available place in the federal budget to secure such funding, is being cut by 30%, from 20.8 million in fiscal year 19 and 20 to 14.7 million for fiscal year 21. Given the various economic and fiscal challenges facing the insular areas, can you help us understand why the department is proposing drastic cuts in the several heavily utilized insular grant programs like technical assistance, which at the same time providing an increase in the funding for the Office of Insular Affairs? Please.
Let me be sure I understand your question. Unfortunately, I'm very hard of hearing, but I understood your comment about the budget. We are very supportive of the insular areas, and I know that Assistant Secretary Doug Dominich, he works with your office and with the governors of the various areas, and we think, of course, that it's a very important area generally in the world for strategic reasons and national defense. I will certainly go back and talk to Assistant Secretary Dominich, but again, let me assure you that we want to work with you, Vice Chairman Sablan, and hope to have a fruitful discussion.
My time is up, Madam. Thank you, Secretary Combs, for responding. I now recognize
McClintock.
Mr. McClintock for
Thank you.
5 minutes.
Secretary Combs, you made a very strong statement in favor of permanent authorization of the LWCF. I'm wondering, though, I mean, if the federal government owns, what, 1.3% of Texas. It owns 0.3% of Connecticut, of New York. It only owns 25% of the Federal District of Columbia. And yet the federal government owns half of my state, of 93% of one of my counties in the 4th Congressional District. It owns 2/3 of Utah, nearly 2/3 of Alaska and Idaho. It owns nearly 85% of the state of Nevada. Now, that's all land that is off the tax rolls. It is all land that has severe economic restrictions on it. It's not producing for the local communities. It's not producing for the tax rolls of those local communities. And the question some of us have is, how much land is enough? Are we like the farmer Lincoln spoke of, who said, I ain't greedy for land, all I want's what's next to mine?
Thank you for that question. I know that it is a part of the President's stated policy to be supportive of conservation, and certainly...
Yeah, but we're not supportive of conservation. We are lousy land managers. We have multi-billion-dollar deferred maintenance backlogs at our national parks. I've got Yosemite National Park in my district. The number of complaints I am hearing from visitors over just lousy maintenance of everything from forest health to facilities is horrendous. Shouldn't we at least be taking care of the land that we already own before we go out and acquire more and more new land? And take that off the tax rolls, take it away from productive use for the American people? I mean, I'm really perplexed by this.
Well, the Public Land Infrastructure Fund is something that the Secretary and the President are very committed to. As you pointed out, right now we have about $16 or $17 billion in deferred maintenance, and you referred to Yosemite National Park.
Are you at least willing to commit that until every bit of the deferred maintenance that we have in our national park system has been addressed, we're not going to be using those LWCF funds to acquire new lands that we can't take care of?
I certainly share your hope and desire.
That's not a hope. I'm asking you, will you make that commitment on behalf of this administration?
I am supporting the president's budget, and I've heard the statement that was yesterday, and I understand that the president is fully willing to commit to $1.3 billion per year to take care of the first start of the deferred.
Even John Jervis with the Obama administration, when I asked him, what should we be using our LWCF funds for, deferred maintenance or land acquisition, he said deferred maintenance. And you're not willing to make that commitment. I find that disturbing.
Let me say that as a steward of the nation's lands, we need to take care of what we have.
With all due respect, we are lousy stewards of the nation's land. Again, when we have that kind of horrific backlog, and yet we're committing funds to buy more and more land, take it out of productive use, and then not take care of it, I'm disturbed. Louis Gohmert had a wonderful description of our lands policy. He said we're like the old miser in town whose own mansion is dilapidated, the paint's peeling, the windows are broken, the weeds are growing in the yard because he's spending all of his time and energy plotting how he's going to buy his neighbor's land.
Well, as a personal land steward in the state of Texas, I manage and maintain my family's ranch that's been in my family since 1882, and I am acutely aware, as you
That's
pointed
because
out,
that's privately owned. You're talking about the federal government taking more and more land and then not taking care of it.
well, and I would, if you don't mind my saying this, I would appreciate it if we would have more funding, which we've been asking for the last years, in the PLIF, the Public Land
But you've got plenty in the LWCF. The problem is you're not using it for deferred maintenance. Let me ask you one more question. We used to take good care of our forests. We would send foresters into the forests every year. They would mark off surplus timber. We would auction that timber off for sale. Companies would pay us to come in, take out that surplus timber. We had healthy, resilient forests, and we also had a revenue stream that funded not only our land management activities, but also 25% went into local governments. Why aren't we doing that now?
Well, that's why we are requesting a categorical exclusion to help assist with the active forest management that you so ably described, Congressman. When you take a look and you have salvage timber, which you're not allowed to salvage or sell, which means that some of the mills have not been doing that well, I would like to
you ought
work
to
with
at
you on
least
that
make the call for LWCF authorization conditional
The
upon
gentleman's
getting
time
those
has
reforms.
expired. I now recognize the Congressman Negus for
Thank
5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Assistant Secretary Combs, for being here today. I found your testimony interesting, both your verbal testimony and your written testimony. With respect to the latter, you stated that President Trump has been clear in his direction and priorities, setting ambitious goals and challenging federal agencies to deliver better results. That statement confounded me because, if anything, the administration has been anything but clear in terms of its priorities and the funding levels that they would like for those priorities. And a great example of this over the course of the last 24 hours is the LWCF, which my colleague from the other side of the aisle was referencing. Do you know how much, or what percentage rather, the budget that the President submitted to this committee cuts the Land and Water Conservation Fund for fiscal year 2021-22?
I don't have that number, but I can get that for you.
So I have the number. The number is 97%. 97%. This is a program that is vital for countless Coloradans, supported by 77% of the people in my state that I represent. And this president's budget requested a 97% cut. Now, I don't know, Assistant Secretary, do you have a Twitter account, or do you use Twitter?
No, sir.
Okay. Yesterday, the president, I applaud you for not using Twitter, the president tweeted out a statement, which I will read. I'm calling on Congress to send me a bill that fully and permanently funds the LWCF and restores our national parks. When I sign it into law, it will be historic for our beautiful public lands. So my question to you is, does the Department of Interior intend to submit an addendum to the budget that you've submitted to Congress to fully fund the LWCF?
Well, let me...
Or rather, I should say, when do you anticipate sending the addendum to fully fund LWCF,
Well,
since the President of the United States has announced that that is his intent?
Well, let me again state that I said his leadership and support for this unprecedented effort is an extremely significant signal for the cause of conservation. And so the president, I don't have a Twitter account, but I heard about what he had said, and the department is supportive of this. I believe that Secretary Bernhardt is making similar statements over in the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee today.
I again, am confused as to how this committee is to proceed. Are we to believe the budget that the Department of Interior has submitted to the Congress of the United States, or the president's tweets, or some combination of both? Because it's unclear to me how we proceed. The LWCF program, in my view and in the view of many of my colleagues, should not be sustaining a 97% cut, as the Department of Interior has suggested. And so I would encourage you to visit with the Secretary to submit the addendum that the President is apparently calling for, because otherwise, this Congress has left with little direction from this administration about how to proceed. Last point I will make with respect to the National Park Service, because on this point I do agree with my colleague, Representative McClintock from California. I happen to represent a district that includes Rocky Mountain National Park, one of the most iconic parks in the United States. Last year, we had record visitation, and yet this budget proposes a $23 million decrease in facilities operation and maintenance, an $18.7 million decrease in visitor services. This is not a partisan issue. Many of my colleagues have districts that are home to some of the most treasured national parks in the United States, and this administration is gutting deferred maintenance and visitor services for these parks. And I know you all are getting calls from constituents just as I am, who are completely frustrated by the inability of the federal government to take care of these national treasures. So with respect, Assistant Secretary, while I appreciate you being here, I don't think it is sufficient to simply say that we're protecting these parks when the budget does not reflect those priorities. And I will give you an opportunity to respond.
Let me again say that we have been trying for 3 years to ask Congress to please fund the Public Land Infrastructure Fund, would address exactly the concerns that you have raised. And so I fully support the Public Land Infrastructure Fund, and we did...
So with respect to Assistant Secretary, if that's the case, why are you asking to decrease visitor services by $19 million? That will result, by the way, in about 1,000 employees in the National Park Service losing their jobs nationwide. Why is the Department of Interior asking Congress to do that?
I think if you take a look at the budget, for our budget, I'm presenting the President's budget for fiscal 21 and comparing it to fiscal 20's budget. And in the delta between the two budgets, we ended up with increased money into deferred maintenance, and a little reduction from the 20 budget in construction because of the additional insight and attention to what constitutes new construction.
I yield the balance of my time.
Madam Secretary, thank you. Mr. Nick, I now recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Fulcher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Assistant Secretary, thank you for being here. I represent the state of Idaho, and it's one of those states that's just about 2/3 federal land, and we're heavily dependent on the federal government and certain programs and just the cooperation, and as you might imagine, that does create a lot of angst sometimes with stakeholders that I represent. But I will say this, the administration makes a big difference in responsiveness and just a willingness to work with us. And your involvement has been positive, and that interaction has been a significant boost for us. And I want to just thank you for that. There was a couple of things that I wanted to just see if you know if this is included in the budget. This was on the docket in our state. One is the Anderson Ranch Dam. Anderson Ranch Dam. The raising of that is on the docket. It was for about a 6-foot raise, and also the Boise Basin storage study. And those are both proposed, but I haven't yet followed up, and I don't know if that's included in the 21 budget. Wanted to know if you knew.
Congressman, I don't have the specific information on those two, but I will get hold of Commissioner Berman, who is the head of the Bureau of Reclamation, and ask her, and we will get back to you with that information.
Please do. All right. Thank you. Second thing is we've got a number of different efforts underway for some title transfer. And you may be familiar with this. There is a Pioneer Irrigation District title transfer that has been proposed, and that's been in the works for several years. And also, and that's with the city of Caldwell in the state of Idaho. And I just wanted to know if, and I know you've worked positively on those in the past, and I just want to know if there's any updates or anything you can share with me on that.
When I asked somebody about it this morning, I was told, I specifically asked about, the title transfers, that they are proceeding, and I will try to get you a more specific timeline. I know that title transfers are incredibly important to the people who need access, and I will get something more specific from you, more than just, I know they're in process.
Great, thank you for that. I agree with my colleagues, Ranking Member Bishop and Representative McClintock. Just, I can't tell you how important it is for those of us who live adjacent to the federal land to be able to have some say in what goes on with that, in the management of that. I've learned in spades since being here just what a difference it is to try to govern in a state with that demographic versus not. And so I'll close up my comments just by saying this, and just hopefully just being a reminder, something that you'll know and think about. But we've got a fabulous industry and a fabulous culture of Idaho ranchers and farmers and sheep herders. And because of that demographic, we need you. And we need that cooperation. And some administrations provide it, some don't. I will tell you, generally speaking, you have. And so that's appreciated, and please share that internally, because until we have some other significant change in how this is all managed, we just desperately need that cooperation.
Let me say thank you very much for those comments. When I was asked to help with the reorganization plan back in January of 2018, the goal was to get decision-making down to the local area. And in particular, people who lease land, they want to be able to talk to somebody on the ground about range conditions, carrying capacity, et cetera. And it is my firm belief that the ability for somebody in Idaho or wherever they are next to federal lands to have the ability to meet face-to-face with somebody, the same time zone, the same geographic area is hugely important, and you get, I think, a much better decision process.
Great, thank you for that. Yield back.
The gentleman's yield his time back. I now recognize Mr. Levin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My thoughts are also with Chairman Grijalva and his family. I want to turn to a report by the Wall Street Journal last week. Perhaps you've seen it, that Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement Director Scott Angel secretly altered internal decision memos to present the appearance that industry's preferred regulatory changes were supported by the career technical experts at the agency, when in fact those changes were contrary to career staff recommendations. Ms. Combs, is it appropriate for political appointees to oversight the policy recommendations of career staff?
Well, I don't know the article you're talking about, so I don't really have any of the facts, but obviously we want every decision to be based on objective facts, sound science, and transparent information.
So if the director of an agency wants to override the advice of career experts, should it be done in a transparent way without doctoring the administrative record?
Let me repeat again that it is my goal and the goal of the administration and the Department of the Interior that all decisions should be open.
Transparent, yes.
Transparent,
Yeah.
peer-reviewed, and
So is
based
it
on sound science.
Forgive me, I'm going to run short on time, but is it transparent then for a political appointee to direct staff over the phone to remove language from a decision identifying the policy recommendation of an expert career staff member?
Well, again, you've referred to something I have no information on, but generally speaking, all decisions.
But would you consider the scenario that I just raised to be a transparent way of operating?
I don't want to take your time.
Well, it's a simple yes or no question. Should political appointees purposefully misrepresent what advice career staff are providing agency leadership?
So let me.
It's a simple yes or no question.
No, let me be a little more thorough, if I may.
I'd like a simple yes or
Well,
no
I'm
answer.
gonna-
I'll ask the question again.
I'm not able to give you a simple yes. or
Reclaiming
no.
my time, simple yes or no answer. Should political appointees purposefully misrepresent what advice career staff are providing agency leadership? Yes or no?
Directors will always make policy decisions, and those should be made.
Is that a yes or a no?
That is my statement.
Well, I can answer it for you. It's completely wrong. It's arguably a violation of the Administrative Procedures Act, and according to the Wall Street Journal, this is precisely what the director did. What's more apparent now is that the industry is literally writing their own rules at your department, and political appointees are all too happy to let them do it. 10 years after the Deepwater Horizon disaster, we should have safety regulators that push back against the worst impulses of the oil industry, not people like this director that rubber stamp industry requests and then manipulate the record to cover their tracks, and that's what happened here. I'd like to turn to renewable energy, if I might, with the time that I have left. In California, we've got the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan, and I would argue it's an example of a model to achieve the goals of renewable energy and environmental stewardship. And I'd like to ask you a few questions about that, if I might, Ms. Combs. How many years did it take for the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan to be finalized?
I do not have that information. Be happy to provide it.
It took 8 years. Were state and local partners involved in the plan's development?
Again, I do not have the details.
They were. What about tribal partners? Did they participate?
Same answer.
Same answer for me. They did. Did BLM receive input from conservation and recreation groups?
I presume that they did.
They did. Did the Department of Defense participate in order to ensure the plan was mission compatible for installations?
I suspect you know.
They did. Basically, the plan was finalized after 8 years of work with input from a wide variety of state, local, and federal agencies, plus the many stakeholders that use and benefit public lands. And I think you'd agree that's no small undertaking. So given all this work, what efforts did the Trump administration take to implement the plan when coming into office?
Well, perhaps you would assist.
Not very many is the answer. So I'm asking, what is the timeline for completion of the review and for the proposed Desert Plan amendment to be shared with the public, because it has not been?
Well, I will take that question back to the department and get you an answer.
I appreciate that. I'd like you to listen to the stakeholders. I urge the department to listen to the stakeholders who spent 8 years coming up with the sensible compromises represented by the DRECP, not to make significant changes to the plan. And with that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Webster. But before I do that, Madam Secretary, with all due respect, I am really trying to be very courteous with you. But we do expect answers as honestly as possible. Thank you. Mr. Webster, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Combs, do you know if the original request for documents that we were talking about at the first of this hearing was that request made on a written document or an electronic document?
Congressman, I don't have the answer to that.
I've been told it's on it was on a written paper document, which I've heard wastes money, but anyway, it happened. And their request, do you know in that request, did it ask for electronic response?
I'm not aware.
You don't know?
I don't know whether it was asked for in whatever form it was asked for.
Yes. Well, I've also read several studies which say that your memory and understanding and comprehension of a written paper document or book or whatever the source is much better if it's on a written typed document as opposed to electronically. And so I don't see anything wrong with responding with a written document, which could be digested much easier than on an electronic document. So I just wanted to make sure that we were talking about the right things, and that is, you've done them a favor by responding with a written document, at least from my standpoint, and as opposed to a electronic form, which would reduce the ability to comprehend or understand what was written.
I must say, Congressman, it is refreshing to find another reader of paper. I have to read a lot of paper. I print them out and recycle them, but I make copious notes, and I think it's really important for me to be able to read the documents. My children are not constrained by paper, but I find that I am able to retain better. I think I will heartily endorse your sentiments and your observations, and I would say that there was no desire to be anything but helpful and responsive in providing written documentation.
Thank you, and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize the gentleman from Guam for 5 minutes, Mr. San Nicolas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I would first like to begin by asking the indulgence of yourself and the ranking member. I do have over half a dozen individuals from my Guam Chamber of Commerce in the room today. They've come from the other side of the world, and they're here with us, and I thank them for their presence and for their support. Mr. Chairman, I appreciated your line of questioning earlier with respect to something that's very, very concerning as well from my perspective as a fellow territory member. We heard earlier that the budget for the interior is roughly $12 billion, and that year over year, we're looking at a $245 million increase from last year, a 2% increase. Of this $12 billion, the assistance to territories makes up less than 1% in FY 2020. For FY 2021, this budget is proposing a 20% cut of that $100 million, making the territorial allocation less than 0.75% of the entire interior budget. Mr. Chairman, it's important to note for the record that territories are under the plenary power of Congress, and we have, over the course of exercising that power, assigned the Department of Interior as the primary agency responsible for carrying out the civilian components of our administration of territories. One of the things that I think we can all agree on in this room is that while there may be political tensions under certain subjects, one of the subjects that I think tensions dissipate on across the board is on the subject of China and the concerns that this country has with respect to Chinese influence globally, but in my particular case, and in our particular case, Mr. Chairman, the concern of China's influence regionally in Micronesia. And China's strategies have been to utilize soft power politics in order to counter our hard power commitments. Guam, as a strategic location for the United States, has very, very large military assets and a very, very strong commitment from the House Armed Services Committee and from the administration, both the Congress and the administration, to ensure that we're investing the necessary resources to maintain our hard power position. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, we are losing the soft power battle very, very badly in Micronesia. The Chinese have already taken steps to secure alliances with the Solomon Islands and Kiribati. They're making very strong overtures into the Federated States of Micronesia just to the south of us, which is a compact state that has treaties with the United States. Guam, as the territory with the largest amount of hard power assets in the region, is slated to receive, along with my other fellow territories, a 20% reduction in the total amount committed by the Department of Interior to territories. And so my first question, Mr. Chairman, is how can we all agree that we need to be ready to face the growing threats of China while less than 1% of our total interior budget is going to fortify territories, and this new budget is now proposing a 20% reduction on top of that very, very small amount?
Well, obviously, you've made very compelling points about the location in the world and the influence of China. And I know that Assistant Secretary Dominich has been working with you and, of course, various other departments, the Department of Energy, the Department of State, Department of Defense, are all, I think, acutely aware. And I would suggest that this is an issue that will be revisited a great deal, and I'll take your comments back to Assistant Secretary Dominich today.
I appreciate that, but you know, Madam Secretary, the numbers speak volumes. And so we can talk about it all we want, we can come to agreement over the threat of China all we want, but when we're seeing a 20% reduction in the assistance to territories, we're not putting our money where our mouth is. And the danger is that we're going to continue to erode support of our territories on the civilian side with these reductions, while China is going to continue to step into the region and provide their incentives and their offers to counter our inability to even maintain what we've already committed. And so, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the committee to please help us to at least reconcile this. This is a proposal from the administration, but at the end of the day, the budget that we're going to put forward is the budget that we're going to consider as a body. And we should at the very least maintain the status quo, if not consider investing further in making sure that our soft power commitments are matching or overcoming the threats that China is presenting in the same area. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
The gentleman used his time back just for some transparency. The 20% cut is in addition to the 16% cut for the discretionary funds. The mandatory spending in OIA's budget goes to the freely associated states. Those cuts can be reduced, but those that comes to the Americans in the area are being cut. At this time, I yield to Mr. Heiss for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary, thank you for being here. For the first time in at least a couple of years, there is a permanent program manager at the American Battlefield Protection Program and a full staff. I'm really glad to see that finally fulfilled. And I guess my question in that regard is, what steps are being taken to try to ensure that the grant processes run smoothly?
Thank you for that question. It's been a lot of effort made in the granting process, and I believe that there is a $10 million request for the American Battlefield Plan. Are you asking about generally the entire grant process of the department, or is it specifically about this?
Well, specifically on this, but I guess broader in a general way as well.
The administration wants to be sure that all grants are administered in a transparent, thoughtful manner. And so a couple of years ago, there was a review process for all of the grants to be sure that the processes were done. What we discovered was that some grants were administered on, various processes. You didn't know who was the recipient. You didn't know if the grants ever got done. And so I'm happy to say that the process was quite lengthy, but all of that authority was turned back over from the Assistant Secretary of Policy Management and Budget some months ago. And so all of the assistant secretaries and the bureaus are now managing all of their contracts. But in addition, Grant Solutions, which will be up and running by late April in the next month, and it's going to be Fish Wildlife Service will be the first ones. There will be a uniform process across all bureaus for all grants, and there you will know who wanted it, who gets it, what it is, and you'll be able to find out, you'll be transparent, and so that the managers, the money will know what they're giving grants for. You will be able to find out what the grants are for, whether the purposes were achieved, and you'll also be able to find out whether we're doing duplication. If somebody asks 7 different bureaus for the same money, you'll find out, well, no, gosh, you don't need to have 7 different bureaus paying for the same work. I think it's extraordinary, and it's Grant Solutions, and it will be up and running by the end of April.
Very good. I thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to yield the remainder of my time to the gentleman, my friend from California, Mr. McClintock.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I was stunned by Mr. Levin's question of you. He appears to think that it's improper for senior administration officials to override career bureaucrats. I would commend to his attention Article 2 of the Constitution, which begins with 15 words. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. It makes no mention of career bureaucrats. Quite the contrary, it is the president who sets executive policy through his senior officials. It is the role of career bureaucrats to carry out those policies. They have no independent power under our Constitution. If it were otherwise, it would mean that the votes of the American people mean absolutely nothing. I want to get to your point on calling for a categorical exclusion for timber salvage, as well as for forest thinning for fire suppression. We were actually able to get a categorical exclusion for for forest thinning for fire suppression for the Tahoe Basin. That's taken the environmental statement from 800 pages down to 20 pages. It's taken the environmental review process from 4 years down to 4 months, but unfortunately it's only limited to the Tahoe Basin. Now, if the administration is going to be calling for full funding of the LWCF and permanent reauthorization, then it seems to me it ought to be conditioning good forest management on that call. And I would, again, like to ask you, what are your intentions, not only with respect to the categorical exclusions from NEPA that are preventing us from properly managing our forests, but also the prioritization of funds for deferred maintenance?
Let me just say yes. We do agree with that. We're working on the categorical exclusions and active forest management, which is why we've asked for $50 million to modify the wildland fire fighting force in order to, we think we could get 1.2 million hours of extra time in order to do active forest management, renew salvage, and I am now...
But it seems to me if you're going to go for the LWCF, you ought to condition it on these reforms, which are absolutely critical to the maintenance of the land we already own.
I think that's a great suggestion, and we'll pass it on. Thank you very much, Congressman.
Yield back and thank again Mr. Heiss for yielding his time.
His time is expired. I now recognize Ms. DeJet for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. Secretary Combs, I wanted to ask you a couple questions. Would you agree that the Interior Department should try and reduce the opportunities for waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement within its program and operations?
Yes.
And I don't know if you are aware, but last spring, the Government Accountability Office issued a report detailing federal programs and office operations that are at the highest risk to waste, fraud, and abuse. Interior's management of federal oil and gas resources was on that list. Were you aware of that?
No, I was not.
Okay. So you wouldn't have any idea why the GAO said that Interior had regressed over the past years, then, if you don't know about the report?
No, but I will be sure to go.
I would appreciate that. So do you agree with the GAO that BLM's 2018 methane revisions will lead to more wasted resources?
So would you repeat that question?
Yeah. The GAO said that BLM's 2018 methane revisions will lead to more wasted resources. Do you know about that?
No, I did not.
Okay. The
I can
reason,
certainly inquire.
yeah. So the reason why they are saying that is because the 2018 methane revisions allowed more methane to be released. And this, of course, is a resource that we could be capturing and making money on. And so I ask these same questions, and I know you're here kind of a pinch hitter today, but I asked these same questions last year because it seems to me if we could capture this, it would actually save the taxpayers money. So I would really appreciate it if you would get back to me on that. And I'll just ask you one more question about the methane royalties. I'm assuming you would agree on behalf of the Interior Department that we should be doing everything that we can to ensure that the government collects all the royalties that it can from methane gas.
It's certainly our goal to get all the royalties that we can from energy production on federal land.
Absolutely. Thank you. My next question, I want to talk to you a little bit about conservation and land planning. There was a recent report that found that the United States is losing its forests, grasslands, deserts, and other natural places at a rate of nearly a football field's worth of land every 30 seconds. And studies like this led to scientists and conservationists calling for about 30% of lands to be protected, lands and waters to be protected by 2030, with a focus on those with biodiversity and productivity. But I don't think some of the agency's policies are actually leading to this goal. For example, the current Eastern Colorado Resource Management Plan covers 668 acres, and 189 acres were determined to be lands with wilderness characteristics. Do you know anything about this Eastern Colorado Resource Management Plan?
No, Congresswoman, I do not.
Okay, so you don't know how many of the areas of the lands that were identified with wilderness characteristics were recommended to be managed for wilderness in the proposed revision to the plan?
No, Congresswoman, but I can certainly attempt to find out.
That would be super if you could do that and supplement your responses. You know, Mr. Vice Chair, I really appreciate the agency sending over the Assistant Secretary, and I know that the Secretary is otherwise engaged with the Appropriations Committee today, but many of these questions that I have today, she's not going to know the answer to this because she's sort of the pinch hitter. I would then, please convey to Mr. Grijalva, obviously, my condolences as well, but also my belief that we should reconvene this hearing and have the Secretary come so that he can actually answer these questions. And with that, I'm going to yield back the balance of my time.
Right.
I'm not going to submit you to questions that you don't know the answers to. Thank you, Mr.
Right,
Chairman.
but members would also submit questions for written response, and I feel bad that they had to send Secretary Combs as a surrogate for Secretary of Interior. And now I recognize Mr. Grace. Oh, Mr. Grace. Oh, Westerman for 5 minutes. Mr. Westerman. Mr. Westerman. I don't control this side of the other. Mr. Westerman, you have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Reclaiming my time and my name, right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Combs, thank you for your testimony today. I want to go a little different approach here that maybe will bring more meaning to this hearing, which personally I think is kind of meaningless to start with, but I want to play some trivia. I want to read a statement and see if you can identify where this statement came from. It says, "No money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequences of appropriations made by law." You know where that came from?
I'm sorry, the Constitution.
Right. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7. Article 1 obviously outlines the duties of the legislative branch. And I know, thanks to Wikipedia, that you've got a Juris Doctorate degree from the University of Texas, so
Gone straight.
So maybe you can help me understand this a little better with your expertise. Who has the authority in our federal government to create budgets and appropriations?
You do.
Congress does. Okay, are you familiar with something called the Budget Control and Empowerment Act of 1974?
It's a guiding document that we all adhere to.
Well, we're supposed to adhere to. Do you know what the first step Congress does under the Budget Control and Empowerment Act of 1974? In the interest of time, I'll tell you. We prepare a budget. I served on the Budget Committee here a couple of terms, and we prepared a budget. Are you aware of a congressional budget that has passed the House?
That it has to pass the House?
Are you aware of one that has passed the House in this Congress?
Not lately.
Are you aware of a
2020.
budget that has passed out of the Budget Committee?
Well, 2020.
There's no budget that's passed out of the House. There's no budget that's passed out of the Budget Committee. So I find it interesting that we're having a hearing
criticizing the administration on their budget proposal when it's the responsibility of Congress to do a budget and to do appropriations. I'm reminded of a line that a guy named Shakespeare wrote in this play called Hamlet, where he had this love interest named Ophelia, and he said, "God has given you one face and you make yourself another." And I think this hearing is more about trying to paint a different face than it is about finding out anything about the budget and how things will be appropriated and spent, because we're not even doing the job of creating a budget, the first step that's supposed to be a framework and guiding principles for doing appropriation bills in the House. How much money can the administration spend on any of these programs that is not authorized by Congress?
Zero.
So if Congress doesn't like the priorities that the administration has set forth, does Congress have power to write the budget and the appropriations the way Congress wants to see them?
That's what the word enacted means.
So if we didn't like the budget, we could write our own budget. Or actually, we have to write the budget before money can be spent.
I think that happens with great regularity.
So are there any programs that you all are proposing that you can spend money on before Congress appropriates money for it?
Well, only if it's multi-year money.
And when will the fiscal year run out in our country?
September 30th.
And what happens if there's not a budget and appropriations by September 30th?
We go into a CR.
How does that affect the operations of the federal government?
Well, it's the same old budget, and so we just do it again.
So you can't do any kind of new spending?
Well, the CR, let's suppose we don't have a budget in the fall, and so you'll have a CR, again, taking again the 2020 money, because you're now in a 2020 budget, and you will spend the money as it was directed by the 2020 budget process.
So if there's something new in your budget proposal that's not in the that's not authorized by Congress, can funds be spent on that?
Shouldn't be.
So if we don't like your budget proposal, do you have a recommendation for Congress?
Well, there is an art to this, I'm sure, and we propose and you dispose.
Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Yeah, thank you. This hearing is entitled Examining the Department of Interior Spending Priorities on the President's Fiscal Year 2021 Budget Proposal. That's why we're here today. Gentlemen's time, I now recognize Mr. Garcia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you, Assistant Secretary Combs. The Bureau of Land Management is undergoing major reorganization, and while the department has claimed a number of benefits from this proposal, I have to say I'm less than convinced. On several occasions, the committee has asked the department for more information, but the department has failed to comply. The little information we have received has not demonstrated a well-considered or planned process, and this is no minor reorganization. We're talking a loss of up to 80% of affected employees who would potentially leave the agency due to forced relocation. You're forcing families, experts, career public servants to pick up and move. This is an absolute effort to undermine and dismantle the Bureau of Land Management. If you would, Ms. Combs, answer in yes or no form, should an agency having specific performance measures to determine whether a reorganization is successful? Yes or no?
We hope that any...
Yes or no?
We hope that...
You don't want to answer that, yes or no, as I've asked?
The question was, can you rephrase?
Should you have specific performance measures for a reorganization to be successful?
Yes, and I believe that BLM
Thank you. Should any reorganization have a cost-benefit analysis with a sensitivity analysis?
I believe that the BLM, and I don't speak for
Is
the
that a
BLM.
yes or a no?
Well, I believe that they have done a great deal of analysis, which I believe has been shared.
So sort of yes? Should an agency organization have an implementation plan?
I believe that there is an implementation plan.
Is that a yes?
That is a sort of yes.
Should an agency reorganization have a clear continuity of operations plan to ensure no loss of work product or knowledge?
A continuity of operations plan to ensure no loss of work, product, or knowledge?
Yes.
Well, that is what any department should do.
Is that a yes?
That is a yes.
Should an agency reorganization include input from agency staff and assess the plan's impacts on staff retention?
Yes.
And finally, can you tell me whether the department has provided all of the documents about the relocation that it has requested, not including the documents the committee reviewed in camera last week?
I will refer you to the leadership of the Bureau of Land Management. I don't have access to those documents.
So you're not sure. Ms. Combs, the department requested $13.6 million from Congress for this move, but you did not think it was necessary to provide sufficient analyses backing this decision?
We do have some documents, and I am told, again, I don't speak for BLM, Bureau of Land Management, but I believe they have done a great deal of analysis.
Can we get those?
I will certainly pass that back to the Bureau
Please
of Land
do.
Management.
These are the best practices identified by the Government Accountability Office and ones this committee has asked for on multiple occasions, but the department has either failed to provide or admitted they didn't do so. And the few responsive documents we've received show only inadequate analysis, unacceptable in any other job sector. These are career federal employees, some with families and roots in D.C., who were forced to make a tough decision. There is a lot at stake here. We're losing institutional knowledge that won't be easily regained for years. When this administration plays with the Bureau of Land Management to meet their political ends, you're jeopardizing the important work the Bureau does in states across the country. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I now recognize for 5 minutes Mr. Gosar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my condolences to the chair for the loss of his mom. I don't know how I would take that, so I give him my best. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Combs, thank you for being here in front of the committee today. I want to highlight Indian water settlements, and particularly the $43 million that has been placed in lieu for settlement there. As you know, in the West, water is a critical resource to every community, and tribal communities are often even more impacted by the need for fairness and the assistance from the federal government in reaching fair, equitable settlements for water rights in the West. The administration has proposed $43 million to meet tribal settlement claims for both water and land in FY2021. Can you help me understand the priorities of this administration on the water side of this equation? And what can you do to ensure that we continue to move this difficult process forward over the next year?
If you're speaking of the general issue of tribal settlements, they're obviously very, very important, and Alan Mickelson, whom you may know, has been leading the department in a number of those, and a lot of effort goes into analyzing them, and then we come to Congress, of course, and ask for assistance in funding those. With respect to, you're talking about sort of farmers, et cetera, other folks working on trying to get, a consensus across the federal government, USDA, et cetera. I would just say that the tribal water settlements are extraordinarily important. There's a very high level of interest within the department about ensuring that those are resolved and that those then come forth to Congress for the funding.
And I know there was a lot of complications, particularly in the drought contingency plan on the Colorado Rivershed because of the lack of settlements for the tribal aspects. So I take it this is a high priority for this administration.
This is an extraordinarily high priority, and I know that the Arizona farmers are working with USDA, et cetera, and the drought contingency plan is important, and I will just assure you that it's being discussed and looked at and studied throughout the department. So
well, I want to touch on that because, every member of the delegation from Arizona sent a letter in regards to that drought contingency plan, which was a key component in regards to the authorization that Congress followed through on the drought contingency plan. And we made promises, particularly to the end users, which ended up being the farmers in Pinal County. Now, my understanding is in that agreement in the basin, BOR has a substantial portion of the infrastructure projects, and that bill ready, quote, is $20 million for water conservation activities in areas that are expending extended drought conditions. These water conservation activities shall include well construction and irrigation related to structural or other measures programs, and projects that result in conservation of other water or groundwater or improve water systems efficiency, resiliency, reliability, delivery, and conveyance. Now, the drought contingency plan, particularly in Arizona, was based on this very fact. Now, trust is a series of promises kept. And I can tell you from my colleagues across the aisle, from California to Utah to all the way across the board, this is a big deal. And I think it's very clear that the farmers that made the concessions in Pinal County deserve to be heard in regards to the infrastructure buildup for the wells and development. Do you see it like I do?
Yes, and I would agree, and I do know that there are people within Interior who are working on this, I think, believe with your office and others, and looking forward to resolving this very difficult, complex issue.
So you share my viewpoint that BOR does have jurisdiction to allow funding for this pumping situation?
I'm sure that the Bureau of Reclamation and Commissioner Berman are aware of this, and I expect that they will be visiting with you.
I thank the gentlewoman, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. I now recognize for 5 minutes the distinguished lady from California, Ms. Napolitano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and of course, my condolences to Raul Grijalva on his death of his mother. Ms. Combs, the Bureau of Reclamation represents the 17 western states as far as water is concerned. Yet we have a great deal of concern that the budget for Title 16 was cut 95%. And it just unreal that the cities and the communities, the states that rely on those funds to be able to expand their ability to counter drought is being reduced. We still have droughts in California and in other states. Can you explain why?
Well, Congresswoman, I'm not familiar with the exact details. I do know that Commissioner Berman handed out a map just on Monday afternoon showing the level of water storage throughout the California area. And I know that water storage is one of the primary tools that the administration believes is the way.
Pardon me, but that would be in Northern California. Southern California still does not have enough water.
And I'm saying the map that I saw was all of California, all of the water issues in California, and I would just simply again say that water is something very important to the administration. It's very important to everyone who lives.
Yes, but do you realize there's $1 billion in already approved projects on Title 16? $1 billion. And you're giving 32%, well, no, and this one is 95% cut. The projects that are most cost-effective to drought management, you're being cut. Why?
The Water Smart and other programs are all very important tools, recycling, reuse, et cetera, but so is storage, and so I'm told that the Bureau of Reclamation proposes
It's a game that you play. The administration sets an amount, and you expect Congress to boost it up. But 95% is intolerable. Southern California has been a leader in modernizing water infrastructure. Do you agree that we should be building on the success of federal programs? This is the most effective program the Bureau of Reclamation has. They assist farms, cities, vulnerable communities with a sustainable water supply. I've introduced legislation to increase funding authorized for Title 16 to 500 million. We have $1 billion in backlog. 500 million just barely scratches the surface. Given a successful track record of the program, could increased funding help create more water to counter future droughts, which are coming?
Congresswoman, I will go ahead and take these comments back to the department.
We can get all kinds of information from all the water agencies in Southern California that tell you the water drought is not over in Southern California. Northern California is doing well, but the water does not travel all the way south, and consequently, we are left holding a bag. We need to have that information. I would like for you to report back to this committee, because there's a lot of members here who have an interest, 17 western states that are represented have an interest in how that funding is allocated.
Thank you.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentle lady yield back. I now recognize 5 minutes to another distinguished gentle lady, the member from American Samoa. You have 5 minutes. Mrs. Redewagen.
Thank you, Chairman Sablan and Ranking Member Bishop, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Secretary Combs, for your testimony. We can all agree that formulating the budget every year, it's not an easy task, and we all have a responsibility to address the nation's debts while ensuring that the country continues to run smoothly and vital programs remain funded. One such program with DOI, the American Samoa Government Operations Account, is small but remains very important to my district. I understand the need for austerity and the budget cuts, but this is not the account to do that, and I'll be working with my colleagues in the Appropriations Committee to maintain funding for this account. The account helps to fund our local schools and, more importantly, our hospital. DOI's justification for the cut is part of their ongoing effort to make the island more self-sufficient, and I'm just as committed as you are to this goal. And last year, we allocated additional funds to do a study on improvements to the local LBJ hospital. Now that the study has been completed, maintaining funding for this account is needed to carry out these improvements and put American Samoa on the same funding as the rest of the country when it comes to health care. This is even more important considering the recent events with coronavirus and my district's proximity to Asia. Secretary Combs, I just got off of a very long flight from American Samoa, but I will be submitting questions for the record. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentle lady generously used back her time. This time I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Hoffman, for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, and no disrespect to you, Assistant Secretary Combs, but we really do need to hear from Secretary Bernhardt. He has been missing from too many of our hearings, and certainly he has been less than cooperative in response to too many of our inquiries. And to give you just one of many examples, I'd like to show on the screen one of the responses I recently received from the department regarding the biological opinions developed for the Central Valley Project in California. I will admit I'm not a professional biologist, and so perhaps there is some relevant scientific information revealed in this document, but I can't see it. The truth is we received multiple boxes that are the same redacted garbage. I don't want to belabor the point or burn up too much of my 5 minutes, but I do want to say that anybody looking at this would agree that it is outrageous. Now, here's an area I believe that you can speak to, the numbers, the budget. We know that numbers don't lie, although liars can certainly use numbers. So, Assistant Secretary Combs, I want to ask, how much money do you believe the first lease sale in the Arctic Refuge will generate? That's just a number answer.
About $1 billion.
And I want to know what you base that estimate on, because it doesn't seem to line up with previous leases. Do you know what the average per acre bid for all lease sales since 1999 in the immediately adjacent National Petroleum Reserve was?
No, I do not.
The answer is $32.34 per acre. And do you know how much the last BLM lease sale in the petroleum reserve was?
No.
It was $11 per acre. So over a couple of decades, we've seen actually the number declining. The average bid has declined quite a bit. And so the next question is, if you were to offer the entire coastal plain of the Arctic refuge for a lease sale, to get the $1 billion that you're projecting, how much would you have to receive on a per acre basis from that lease sale?
I'm sorry, I don't know the number of acres, therefore I cannot do the
It's a
arithmetic.
pretty easy calculation. If you divide 1.56 million acres, to get $1 billion, you'd need to get about $678 per acre. So here we have an $11 per acre record in the adjoining National Petroleum Reserve. And that's an area where we have data, where we actually have some infrastructure. We know what's there. We have none of that in the Arctic Refuge, and yet you are assuming something that's 60 times greater per acre in the Arctic Refuge, $678. What makes you think that this oil and gas play in a wildlife refuge is going to be so much better than the developed field next door and will reverse a 20-year downward trend in bid prices?
Well, that is a question that I will refer to the Bureau of Land Management because they will have done the necessary underlying analysis.
So you're unable to answer that question?
I do not have the underlying data.
All right. If there is, you may not know this one either, but I have to wonder as I look at this, if there's so much interest to justify this fanciful assumption in the Arctic Refuge lease sale, why not set a minimum bid, right? If it's 60 times more valuable than the neighboring field, why not set a minimum bid to make sure you get that value for the taxpayers?
That is certainly a suggestion that I will take from you back to the Bureau.
Would you agree a minimum bid to get the value you've promised in the Tax Act and in your budget? That's a good idea?
I will take that back to the Bureau because they're in the business of oil and gas exploration. I am not.
All right. I want to ask you about the political purge underway in the Trump administration. This has obviously been well reported. We know that the Chief Justice Thomas's wife, Ginny Thomas, is working on a list of people who are politically disloyal. Donald Trump Jr. has talked about it. You can't turn on certain Fox News shows without hearing about it every single night. And Axios recently reported that I guess the person who's now in charge of White House personnel, a 29-year-old boy wonder named Johnny McEntee, has gathered cabinet-level officials to begin working further through this purge. We've already seen the purge begin. Now, you're in charge, as I understand your testimony, of workplace culture and transformation. Puts you in a pretty good position. I'm just wondering, how does this hit list and this purge work with your job transforming the workplace?
Well, that's a very strangely interesting question. The goal of the workplace culture transformation is to go ahead and improve the environment at the department.
Has Mr. McEntee talked to you about the hit list?
I'm going to have to cut this off. I apologize, but
Shoot.
can you respond to that in writing, Secretary Crow, please?
Sorry, could you say that again,
Could you
please?
respond to Mr. Hoffman's question in writing, please?
Certainly.
I now have to recognize Mr. Graves for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Combs, thanks for being here. Ask you a question. Of all of the activities of the department, which activity that you all administer generates the most revenue?
Mineral leasing, the Bureau of Land Management.
Okay, so the Bureau of Land Management leasing as opposed to the offshore leasing?
Beg your pardon, it's combined. Combined total of the Office of Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, and BLM together produce about $11 billion. Maybe it's almost 12.
Yeah, and as I recall, last year, you actually hit a top number in regard to the most energy produced in the Gulf of Mexico, I believe, ever. And I think that the corresponding revenue resulting from that, as I recall, exceeds the revenue from BLM. And so if I'm correct, and I'm not going to ask you to verify now, but if I'm correct, then that would mean that we bring in more money from offshore energy revenues than anything else that's done at the department, which is to the tune of several $billion annually. I think the last year of the Bush administration, it was $15 billion from offshore alone. If you look at Land and Water Conservation Fund, what is the source of revenue to fund the Land and Water Conservation Fund?
The Gulf of Mexico energy.
Mm-hmm. And so if you carry out activities to stop or depress offshore energy, then what happens with Land and Water Conservation Fund?
They would obviously be a direct reduction.
Okay. And you may have recently seen that there is apparently some type of proposal coming out of the Senate that I believe some White House officials may also be supportive of, that would permanently fund mandatory spending, Land and Water Conservation Fund, and backlog maintenance. Both of which are going to come from, of course, Land and Water Conservation Fund coming from offshore energy, and the maintenance portion coming from, we hadn't seen the text yet, but I assume a combination of offshore energy and onshore energy. So can you both have policies and efforts to prevent oil and gas production and to have Land and Water Conservation Fund, Historic Preservation Fund, backlog maintenance? Can you have both? Can you have your cake and eat it too?
If you depress the source of the income, then you don't have the income.
Now, I want to be very clear. I am opposed to what the Senate and the administration came out and supported for one main reason, and that's because all of that revenue, or the majority of that revenue, comes from the state that I represent, South Louisiana. We produce more offshore energy than everyone else combined, times multiple figures. But how in the world can we have land, and my friend Mr. Lowenthal and Mr. Huffman, who just left, they both came and saw it firsthand. How can you have this extraction of revenue, this diversion of revenue to other places, and have the greatest land loss, coastal wetlands loss, 90% of the coastal wetlands loss in the continental United States? How can you do that? How can you say we're going to divert money and spend it on conserving other areas, yet the very area where the revenue comes from, you entirely neglect and don't put additional investment into actually sustaining that area, that ecological productivity, and that revenue stream?
Well, obviously, the areas you're talking about do need to be sustained and do need to be worked on, and they are the source of the revenue.
So you can't have both. I mean, it's an unsustainable funding stream if it's an unsustainable area. Does that make sense?
What you have to do is try to figure out what you want most. Do you want the money, or do you want the results?
So, Madam Secretary, I just you can't have the revenue or the results. You can't choose. Because the revenue goes away if you're not investing in sustaining the area. The revenue stream dries up. You can't have both unless you make investments back in the area. And so that's what I'm asking you to take back to the department. This is absolutely ridiculous and short-sighted by the administration and by the Senate. And this whole concept of dedicating nearly $1 billion a year to acquire new land when you already have, a $13 billion maintenance backlog. Who does that? I mean, that's crazy. We have an extraordinary deficit. Investments in the coastal resources of this community is proven to actually pay for itself over and over again. So I hope you're able to take that back to the department. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Mr.
And
Grace.
yield back.
The time's expired. At this time, I recognize Mr. Lowenthal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I too wish to send my condolences and love to Chairman Grijalva on the loss of his mother. And thank you, Secretary Coombs, for coming. I'd like to address another issue we haven't talked about, and that's the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, or the MBTA. It was enacted in 1918. It implements treaties between the United States, Canada, Mexico, Japan, and Russia for the protection of migratory birds. These treaties, as you know, prohibit the taking, the possession, the import, the export, the transportation, the sale, or the trade of any migratory bird or its parts, its nests, or its eggs. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act has protected more than 1,000 species of migratory birds from overhunting and industrial activities. After Deepwater Horizon, BP was required to pay $100 million in fines under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, its incidental take provision, for killing more than 1 million birds. The fines went towards wetland and migratory bird conservation, and I think we can all agree that wetland and migratory bird conservation was much needed following such a huge disaster. However, the Trump administration issued a solicitor's opinion and a proposed rule to reinterpret the Migratory Bird Treaty Act to no longer prohibit the unintentional killing of birds, known as incidental take, by energy companies and other industries. To me, this administration has again given another handout to oil and gas companies with the reinterpretation which severely limits the scope of the MBTA, reverses progress by both Republican and Democratic administrations in minimizing bird deaths, and undermines international obligations under a number of bilateral bird treaties. So my questions are, I have two. The first one is, what do you envision the process will look like for finalizing the rule? Will the department finalize the long overdue birds of conservation concern list, which it assured us in this committee would be out last fall before doing the environmental impact analysis? When will the public comment on the environmental impact statement occur? And do you commit to holding public hearings?
Congressman, thank you for your question. I am not connected to the MBTA matter, that is Fish, Wildlife, the solicitors, but I will certainly take back your question to the department.
Well, thank you. I certainly hope, and I would like you to take back another question and maybe kind of answer it. In the bill, we talk about requiring, if companies did not want to be fined, and we were not into fining companies, we were just into protecting migratory birds, and we said, if you follow best practices, you will not be open to any kind of fine. So the question to you is, why shouldn't companies be required to use best practices to reduce the likelihood of incidental take, as is in the bill that we've introduced, the Migratory Bird Protection Act? Wouldn't it be good, instead of getting rid of wouldn't it be good to require them just to do best practices?
Congressman, that's a great question, and I will certainly take that back to the department.
Well, thank you very, very much. I have another, so let's move on. Maybe this you can help. I'll yield back. This will take long. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll yield back. And I hope to have an answer back. I would hope that you would respond to the committee with the questions about the Migratory Bird Act.
The gentleman yields back, and now I'd recognize the ranking member, Mr. Bishop, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Secretary Combs. Appreciate you being here. You've been forced to ask some really weird questions so far. And for those of you who have a difficult time with the amount of information that's coming from this DOI, I wish they had been around to see the kind of information we were getting from Sally Jewell in the last DOI. Even when she agreed to make changes in how that information was developed, her staff said, she doesn't make those decisions, we do, and we still got redacted crap. So this Department of Interior is much more responsive to Congress as far as the information they're giving than has happened in the past. But I want to go to a different area, if I could, which is still talking about LWCF again, because there are some unique things that are going on, and it's hard to kind of pin down, especially after yesterday's tweet. In the Senate hearing where you were testifying last year, you said it is really important for us to examine each parcel. This is federal land acquisition under LWCF. It's important to us to examine each parcel, and if there is a potential net negative burden and it's outweighed by the positive benefit. That's exactly the way it ought to be done. Unfortunately, under the status quo, that's not what happens with LWCF funds already. According to a recent GAO report, a fifth of the LWCF projects are outside the budget submission process, which you were defining when you talked to the Senate. It may come as news to you. I'm sure it will come as news to my colleagues, but there's simply, GAO broke it down into three basic buckets of LWCF money. The line item projects, the ones you actually go through a process for, and that you identify projects, have a score, rank them, and submit them to Congress for consideration. That's about 80% of the money. But there is also recreation access, up to 10% of the money. There's time-sensitive projects, emergency hardship, it's up to 12%. In fact, some of the things people were complaining about zeroing out in the president's budget were those programs that are then just plussed up by Congress, whether you want them or need them or not. Problem is, in the bucket number one, the GAO stuff that you do, according to them, it's interesting. You have general tips like from the Park Service of try not to leave any sections blank, put something in if possible. 1 point is better than no points, and my favorite is don't invent anything, but give yourself a little bit of credit. I'm not really concerned about that first bucket because that has the most transparent and oversight of any of them. I'm concerned about the other two buckets that we're talking about here, those other two categories that I just mentioned, where appropriations are made after Congress has appropriated. The categories are discussed after Congress has made an appropriation for land acquisition according to the GAO. So our staff has sought for years some kind of information from the departments. 5 years ago, we got a letter from Mr. Grijalva and some of those who are still on this committee asking about how that process works. And in this letter, they said that was an unusual request given that each purchase has first been approved by Congress before being carried out by the respective agencies. The bottom line is that's not what's happening in those two buckets, which I simply call a slush fund. We have received information from BLM and Fish and Wildlife on how they handle those two buckets. We have not received any information from the Park Service. I wish you could help us getting those kinds of information back again. But I am sure we need to look at the process of how we get that information and make sure that everything that comes through under recreation access, time sensitive, that there is an accountability process that becomes clear of what it is. According to the GA report, what we have found, not just now, but for years, is that simply we have been acquiring thousands of acres of land, spending millions of dollars without ever going through the budget submission process and with almost no government congressional oversight for those areas. So in your testimony, you broached upon that, which is exciting and interesting. I hope we can work together to continue with that. If you can help me get the Park Service to respond to our inquiries, I'd appreciate it. But also if we can work together to make sure that the selection process we go through does have some kind of transparency and does kind of oversight. Now, as I mentioned, your budget recognizes that problem. But in the past, as well as in the future, Congress has ignored that recommendation and just put money into there in what I simply look at as a slush fund in which acquisition takes place without any kind of prior approval, without any kind of understanding to it. So I thank you for your testimony. I hope you will commit to work with us to make sure we look at those processes, to make sure if there is LWCF, especially if LWCF funds becomes mandatory, we have a process so there's at least some kind of transparency with it.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
No, I was supposed to demand a yes/no answer there. Yes, no, yes, no.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I now recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Soto, for 5 minutes. 5 minutos.
Gracias. Thank you, Chairman. I think it's important to get some context of how we got here today. We were able to pass a 2020 appropriations bill. Most of this committee voted for it, got their priorities in it, and now we'll work on a 2021 appropriations bill. I'm glad that we're reminded of the power that Congress has for the purse. It would be great to see more than silence when President Trump misappropriates money for the border wall. Because if Congress has the purse, how does that happen? But how do we get here? We had the GOP tax package that doubled the deficit to $1 trillion. 85% of the benefits went to the top 1% richest Americans, and GDP hasn't cracked 3% in the last 3 years. So there's a lot of pressure, and we understand that, Assistant Secretary Combs, to have to cut based upon this giant $1 trillion deficit that we now have. I come from Florida, and we face issues with algae blooms, so I wanted to focus on that particular question. The administration has proposed a $53 million cut for the U.S. Geological Survey's Water Resources Mission Area. This includes cuts to the Water Resource Availability Program that studies and analyzes water quality issues, such as nutrients, sediment, pesticides, and the contaminants associated with harmful algae blooms. With climate change threatening our nation's water supply, we need the best available data to help combat harmful algae blooms in Florida and across the country. Secretary Combs, do you believe that USGS plays an important role in providing water data and analysis to support our clean drinking water and a healthy environment in Florida and around the nation?
I think that the USGS has three primary issues they deal with, of course, earthquakes, volcanoes, and hydrological matters. And I know that the Corps of Engineers is also very involved with some water quality issues, certainly in the Everglades, et cetera. But we do some measuring. Obviously, the USGS does measuring, and then there's NOAA, and of course, EPA, and other folks do other things together.
As you know, in Florida, the environment is a very bipartisan issue. We have tourism and agriculture as our main issues. So what effect do you think substantial cuts to the Water Resources Mission Area could have on harmful algae blooms? And what would the administration be able to do to work with us to raise those funds?
Well, let me just say that obviously we want to work with the affected parties in whatever state, and you're from Florida. I also know that the Corps of Engineers has been a lead in a lot of the water quality issues, and so I believe that they're making a very substantial request for funds, is what I've been told, but we'll certainly look forward to working with you.
As we craft our budget, I suspect we won't see this type of cut, and so I'm hopeful that we could work together on this to protect Florida, the president's now new home state, and one that, if we have continued algae blooms, is really going to hurt our coasts, our businesses, our quality of life, and the future of our state. With that, I yield back.
Okay, thank you, I now recognize Mr. Cunningham for 5 minutes.
Hey, good morning, Ms. Combs. How are you?
Fine, thank you.
Thank you for being here today. We appreciate it. Still morning here for another 9 minutes. I wanted to ask you about, in January 2018, the Department of Interior proposed opening up more than 90% of the U.S. federal waters to oil and gas development. Can you describe your role in that decision?
I had no role with anything related to the oil and gas.
So you had no input on opening up these federal waters back in 2018 to oil and gas exploration?
I arrived on January the 25th, 2018, and I was to deal with matters related to drawing some lines on a map. Had nothing to do with oil and gas, and still have not.
Okay, so you came onto the scene after this announcement was made in January 2018, is that correct?
I had nothing to do with it. I mean, I got here January.
Okay, I'm just asking though, did you come on board before or after this decision was made in January 2018?
Well, I came on board January 25th of 2018, and I don't know the exact date the decision was made, but I came on to assist with reorganizing 8 bureaus and 49 regions into 8 bureaus and 12.
Do you have any opinion as to that decision to open up the federal waters?
I'm not sufficiently informed.
Okay. So you have no opinion one way or another on whether or not that was the right decision. Is that correct?
I would defer to the department. I'll be glad to take your question back to the department.
Okay. And can you explain to us exactly why that program is currently on hold?
No, I cannot explain that to you, but I can certainly take that question back to the department.
Okay. So you don't have any information as to why that?
I believe there's some analysis going on, but again, I'm not privy to the analysis, and I can take that question back to the department.
It's safe to assume the department intended to opening up those waters along our eastern seaboard off of the coast of South Carolina, which is a district that I represent. It's clear that by that decision in January 2018, that they intended to open up those waters to offshore drilling. Is that correct?
That was what I read.
And there has been no change in the department's policy as to that intention to keep those areas open. Is that correct?
I'm not aware of the exact intentions at this time. I know that the plan does not expire till, I believe, 2022 or 23, so I will take your question back to the department.
Okay. So sitting here today, if I were to say that the department's position has not changed in opening up the federal waters to offshore drilling, you would have no evidence or information to refute that, would you?
I have no information either way.
Okay. All right. So you have no evidence to refute the previous position?
Or to support.
Okay. And so as it relates to our district off the coast of South Carolina, on the coast of South Carolina, our coastal mayors, Republicans and Democrats, Mayor Jimmy Carroll on Isle of Palms, Mayor Tim Goodwin on Folly Beach, and Mayor Pat O'Neill on Sullivan's. What should I tell them, or do you have anything to tell them as to whether or not they can rest easy that oil rigs will not be placed off the shoreline?
Well, I would, of course, defer to Secretary Bernhardt, and I would raise the question with him.
Okay, so you have no information one way or another. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And do you have any role at all in the issuance of seismic permit?
None.
Okay. When I spoke with Secretary Bernhardt, he led me to believe that those permits would be issued in the very near future. You don't have any information about that, correct?
No, sir.
Okay. So what I'm hearing today, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you have no role and no position on the department's decisions to issue seismic permits or to open up the waters to offshore drilling. Is that correct?
Those decisions are made by other bureaus and other individuals.
Okay. So that's a yes then, right?
That's I have no information. It's made by other folks.
Okay, that's my question. All right, well, I'd be very interested to get those other folks in here to answer those questions that are pertinent to my community and my district. I thank you for coming, though. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yield back. At this time, I recognize Mr. Gallego for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Secretary Combs, I know you're aware of this year's budget request repeatedly mentions Interior's commitment to working with DHS on border security and the wall. In fact, just last week, your Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Mr. Cameron, testified about the steps the Department of Interior is taking to facilitate the destruction of tribal burial grounds and other special places along our border, including within Oregon Pipe National Monument. Given that this is such a high priority for the department, I want to know how much of Interior's budget is being funneled into border wall or border security and the destruction of resources that your department is explicitly charged with protecting. After all, you are requesting a 16% overall budget cut, so it's especially important to understand where resources are being prioritized. So let's start with the National Park Service. Your budget requests $2.5 billion for the Park Service's main operation account. That's a $57 million decrease. We know that the Interior is already taking law enforcement officers from our understaffed parks and deploying them to the border. Is any of the Park Service's law enforcement funding in the Park Protection account being used to facilitate construction of the President's border wall?
It is not being used to facilitate construction, but there are funds being used to protect our resources and our fish and wildlife refuges in our parks.
Can you be more specific? Are you saying that you're using that money for specifically areas along the border? Or are you just saying in general?
Well, if you were asking about the border, is that what you asked? With respect to the border, there are rotating teams of staff that go to protect our national parks and our wildlife refuges, and that adds up to about $30 million a year. This is rotational to protect our assets within our lands.
Interior requested a more than 50% cut to the Park Service's construction account. That cut would drastically limit the Park Service's ability to work on new projects. Are any of those already strapped funds going to support the President's border wall or infrastructure that is needed for constructing the wall on public lands?
With respect to construction, you may have heard me state earlier that there was a reduction in some construction accounts, which were then plussed up in the deferred maintenance account. And so basically, it was almost level.
Yeah, but more specifically, is any of that money being funneled to wall money?
Are you asking me if any funds in the construction account?
Yes.
The answer is no.
Okay. Let's move on to BLM. Interior requests a 10% decrease for BLM's main management of lands and resources account. This account pays for law enforcement and other resources protection activities, for example, protecting priceless areas such as Bears Ears. Are any funds from the resource protection and maintenance account being used to support construction of the President's border wall?
So are you asking me again if any of the BLM funds are being used? I'm sorry, could you, it was a little fast for me.
Interior requested a 10% decrease for BLM's main management of lands and resources account. So I'm asking for the BLM's main management account. Is it being used for border wall construction?
No.
None of it's being funneled at all. Okay. Moving on. Are any funds from the Realty and Ownership Management account being used to facilitate the additional transfer of lands from BLM to the Department of Defense?
I don't have the answer to that question, and I will take it back to the department.
For the record, you'll submit it to us then. Interior proposed cutting BLM's transportation facility maintenance by over 25%. Are any of these funds going to be going to the border wall and border security efforts, or border security efforts?
We'll certainly take that question back.
To your knowledge, are any other Park Service or BLM funds going to the border wall? If so, which accounts are they coming from?
I'm not aware of any funds going to the border wall.
Okay. Can you please respond to the questions in writing, in general, how much your department is already diverting for the wall if you don't have those numbers in front of you right now?
I will take those back.
And you will respond in writing. You could take something back, but I'd like to hear that you're going to respond.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So the reason I have this line of questions is I have people that come to me every day saying that we need better management of our national parks. I'm from Arizona. I have lots of national parks, and we have beautiful parks both north and south, even though we're blowing through one of them. But every day we hear about the backlogs, and so it's discouraging when I have these budgets that are coming that show what in my opinion are a commitment to not properly taking care of this place, while at the same time I suspect, like many people, that our parks budget is also being funneled for a useless wall instead of taking care of the priorities that we have outlined in Congress. So I hope to hear back from you about those questions I submitted. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. At this time, I recognize Mr. Horsford for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Assistant Secretary Combs, I want to start off with a congressional correspondence issue I have been having with your office. The YMCA of Southern Nevada has a stalled application with the BLM to purchase land which was approved by the BLM district, state, and national office, subject to publication in the Federal Register. A formal notice of realty action was forwarded to the Department of the Interior for review and approval in July of 2019. I sent an inquiry in January of this year asking why this has been delayed. Can you tell me why your department has stalled this application and why I, as a member of Congress, a member that serves on the committee that oversees your department, can't get a response in over several months?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Certainly, the Office of Congressional Liaison is the entity that deals with congressional correspondence, and I will take this question back. What was the date of the letter that you sent? January what?
January 28, 2020. I brought a copy for your...
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
I appreciate a response. Thank you. I'm also concerned that this is not a one-off, that information falling through the cracks, that there's lack of transparency, that it's inevitable result of poorly planned reorganization of the BLM. This is what happens when congressional liaisons are sent thousands of miles from Washington, D.C., and as my colleagues have mentioned throughout this meeting, your department has done little to ensure us that this relocation will be of any benefit to the BLM. I'm from Nevada. My district covers 52,000 square miles. About 2/3 of my district is federally managed land between the BLM, Wildlife, and Forest Service. So this has a direct impact on the everyday lives of my constituents, our businesses, our counties. So this is not a joke. It's not a joke to the American people. And moves like the BLM reorganization make it more difficult for agencies to fulfill their day-to-day responsibilities. So I just would like a commitment that you will produce the documents that this committee has requested, or to inform us that you have provided all the documents available to answer our request. Is that a sufficient enough thing to ask on behalf of my constituents?
Yes, sir. It's very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Switching gears, I'd like to take a moment to address the lack of diversity at the department. A little over 5,000 DOI employees are GA-14 and GS-15. These are some of the highest level positions in the department. Yet of those, less than a quarter are persons of color. Do you believe that there's systemic discrimination within the most senior positions preventing the inclusion of people of color in the department?
No, I do not.
So what policies does DOI have in place to address issues of race-based discrimination?
We have very strong policies in place, and there is Personnel Bulletin 1801, which expressly deals with harassing conduct and dealing with discrimination, and then the Workforce Culture Transformation Advisory Council, which I referred to in my early remarks, which I chair. We take this issue very, very seriously. We are finishing up about 8 separate intergenerational and bystander intervention, which will train about 2,300 supervisors on these issues.
I'm going to reclaim my time. Those are compliance-driven. In order to reflect diversity, you need to have a culture that is accepting of diversity. And so I would really like to see what the recruitment plans are, what the outreach plans are, and to ensure that the department is doing everything besides just being compliant with federal law. Let me conclude by asking about the DOI released Environmental Justice Annual Implementation Report. There was a report in 2015 and 2016 that DOI had been implementing the goals of environmental justice within the scope of its mission and areas of jurisdiction. Why has the department not released an update of this report since 2016? And can we expect a similar report from the department this year?
Yes, you can.
And why hasn't the department updated it?
I think it's been worked on, but it does need to be issued, and it will be so in 2020.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The issues of diversity are critically important. I hope the department understands that this is a primary priority of our chairman and of this committee, and we will ensure the department is doing everything to provide diversity and inclusion throughout the department. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Horsford. At this time, I'd recognize Mr. Costa for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman. This work that the committee's doing today is, I think, really kind of the meat and potatoes of what important oversight is, and that is to make sure that we are pursuing and following up as members of Congress appropriations that are important to implement programs that the Congress either has enacted or has oversight of. And so to that degree, let me focus, Madam Secretary, on a couple areas of interest of mine. There's a 16.1% cut to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which I think would undermine its ability to effectively implement and manage critical programs under the Endangered Species Act. This is law, the Endangered Species Act. We have to implement these programs under the National Wildlife System that were designated to protect wildlife and conserve habitat, as well as to facilitate other efforts. How do you intend to do that with this kind of a cut?
Obviously, the Fish and Wildlife Service budget, which they prepared, is meant to focus on recovery of species, which is critically important.
No, we understand what the mission is. How do you expect to do that with the cuts is what I'm wondering.
Well, the Fish and Wildlife Service has, in its president's budget, has focused on the delivery of the services such as recovery and going ahead and doing things in a more efficient, effective manner.
Yeah, I understand, but I think the cuts don't take that into account. We always talk about that. I think that's penny wise and pound foolish, and programs that the administration cares about, they're going to find out that they're going to have difficulty implementing because they are not complying with other elements of the law. Drastic cuts to the Western drought funding for the Bureau of Reclamation includes 86% cut on the Water Smart grant programs and a 95% cut to tidal water reuse programs. I know one of my colleagues earlier questioned you about this. What's your response?
Well, obviously, the Water Smart program is important, and so is the reuse, but in addition to that, storage is critically important, and so the Bureau of Reclamation budget attempted to balance the issue of these great tools such as Water Smart and the recycling and reuse along with storage, tried to have a balanced approach to water issues.
Well, I will talk with the Secretary about this, but I just want to say, and you can certainly pass this along, as we're considering the budget later this year, I don't think the President's proposed budget is going to get the job done, and I think you're going to find Congress on the Senate and the House changing those funding levels. Let me quickly, with time still, we have many challenges in California as it relates to our water reliability, and the administration has been engaged, and I appreciate that. Recently, the record of decision was signed as it relates to the biological opinions. We have an opportunity to change the paradigm shift, and there has been efforts to work both with the Governor Newsom and his efforts on these biological opinions. There's three parts of it. There's the biological opinions, which we're trying to work to get the state and the feds on the same page. It's a little more complicated now, but I think we can still do that. There's the voluntary agreements, which are critically important. There's also the efforts to move forward with a reauthorization of the WIN Act. All of these are critical if we're going to get our groundwater in balance, and with impacts of climate change. I mean, we haven't had rain in California for now 2 months. The allocation that you folks came up with last week was 15%, and it doesn't look very positive unless we get one wet March with a lot of snow that's going to change a lot, sadly. So, would you please provide an update on how this year's budget will be able to provide funding so that we can deal with the habitat restoration that the state's concerned about, so we can get on the same page on the biological opinions, which I think is absolutely, and I applaud the administration. I've supported the new biological opinions. As a matter of fact, I started that with Senator Feinstein in 2010, and then we got the last administration in 2014 to start the reconsultation process, which over the last 6 years culminated in the signing last week of the record of decision.
Yes, we will get back to you, Congressman. I mean, I'm not in charge of the Bureau of Reclamation, so I'll have to take this back to the Secretary and to, of course, Commissioner Berman.
But you get the interrelationship between, I know it's a big department, but if we're not working together on all of this, we can't make it happen.
I totally agree, and we do plan to work together on this. And thank you for your interest in this, because obviously it's important to you and your constituents in California.
Well, it's critical to, I mean, we measure our water on 10-year averages, and we had a great winter last year. This year it doesn't look so good. And we've got to try to get this right to shift the paradigm as it relates to the implementation of the biological opinions as well as the voluntary agreements to balance our water needs. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The gentleman's time has expired. Now I recognize Mr. Cox for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for being here, Mr. Combs. As my colleague, Congressman Costa is saying, it's very dry out in California right now, and those conditions pinpoint the need to have more storage to take advantage of wet years like last year. And I know that many of us are eagerly awaiting to see Interior's list of projects for WIN Act funding. Do you have a timeline when the department plans to sending that list up to Congress?
I think we're going to make the deadline. I think it's supposed to be maybe next month.
Right, just.
I'm sorry, we'll get back. I'll talk to Reclamation. But we will, of course, get you the list.
Yeah, naturally. And then, and when can we expect Interior to start soliciting projects for next year? Or is this just something that we do on a?
Let me say that I will talk to Commissioner Berman, and I know it's an important issue for you, and we will get back to you, but I will talk to Commissioner Berman.
Thanks so much. And certainly in my district, we have 3 major conveyance facilities. We have the Frank-Kern Canal, the Delta-Mendota Canal, and the California Aqueduct. And these have all lost water carrying capacity because of subsidence. And we're glad to see the department's made this a priority to addressing these issues. But can you talk more about the resources Interior's making or proposing to make available for conveyance and the fixing of these facilities?
With respect to the subsidence issue and the conveyance of water, I know that there's a couple of options being looked at. Again, I would defer to Commissioner Berman. The question is, do you use the same path or not? I don't have the data on that, but I understand that it's critically important, and we will get that information to you.
Yeah, we're trying to work hand in hand with the department. You may know that I've introduced HR 5316, the Move Water Now Act, which is targeted towards these conveyance facilities, particularly the Frank-Kern Canal. And Congressman Costa and I have another bill to address the Delta-Mendota Canal and the California Aqueduct. Very, very important to what we need to be able to get water to where it's needed.
Well, obviously, the movement of water is critical, and the conveyance structures and infrastructures are critical. And when you have a subsidence issue, which of course you're aware of, Frank-Kern, we're trying to help with the state, try to figure out a way to make it work, get it back operating.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, and we'll follow up on that. And on another subject, and I think my colleague, Mr. Neguse from Colorado, made the point, is that there seems to be a bit of a discrepancy or dichotomy with regard to the Land and Water Conservation Fund. Is this something that is supported by the agency?
Yes, in fact, in my opening comments, I stated that we did support it.
Yeah, I beg your pardon, I was in an Ag Committee meeting. But it seems, and certainly the President the other day, tweeted out that he commends the work of a couple senators protecting the Conservation Fund for years to come. But in his budget, he's basically proposing to more or less eliminate it.
Well, we support the administration's policy, and we were given new direction yesterday.
Yeah. Well, the policy is reflected in the hard numbers, which is basically zero. Or it's not zero, but it's a fraction of what has been funded in the past.
Well, the president made clear his new direction yesterday, and we are supporting that direction.
All right. Well, let's hope it doesn't change again. On an entirely different subject, it's very concerning that Interior removed the terms gender and sexual orientation from its 2017 ethics guide in preventing workplace discrimination against employees and replaced them with just a single term sex. Since the department in Interior was under no legal obligation to make this change, why did the department remove sexual orientation and gender from its list of protected statuses?
Well, I don't have the information about that. I will tell you that Secretary Bernhardt has made it unequivocally clear that he is very supportive of diversity of all types in the department, which is why he authorized me to set up the Workplace Culture Diversity and Council, and we worked very, very hard on that, and we will be having a online training in about June by a vendor for all 65,000 employees on all of the issues you've raised, whether it is, gender, race, whatever. It is going to be covered, and every person in the department will be required to take the training. We are very supportive of the appropriate, positive, inclusive culture at the department.
Thanks so much, Mr. Combs. I'm out of time. Appreciate you being here.
Madam Secretary, we have one more member. I recognize Mr. Brown for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me start by offering my deepest sympathy and sincerest condolences to Chairman Grijalva and his family for the loss of his mother. My wife Carmen and I will keep the Grijalva family in our thoughts and prayers. Madam Assistant Secretary, I'm deeply concerned, and I think a number of members on the committee have expressed with the administration's decision to relocate the Bureau of Land Management's headquarters out of the National Capital Region. And despite multiple requests, which I'm sure you've been made aware of this morning, from the committee's chairman, the administration has repeatedly failed to provide even the most basic of information about the move. 97%, as you know, of the BLM employees are already located out of the National Capital area, and the employees that are in the National Capital Region are here out of what I think are kind of necessity and proximity to the department headquarters as well as the White House. And that's why I joined my colleague and my colleagues from around the region in co-sponsoring Congresswoman Norton's bill to require the BLM headquarters to remain in the region. I also joined my colleagues in co-sponsoring legislation to require all federal agencies headquarters to remain in the National Capital Region unless Congress provides for its relocation. So I think that the administration's move puts institutional knowledge and expertise of the federal government at risk. This relocation would uproot the lives of hardworking federal employees and their families, many of whom live in my congressional district, or force them to find new work elsewhere. And I think that this move would have real significant consequences for my constituents as well as the overall mission of the agency. So, Assistant Secretary, can you share with us how many staff have left the BLM as a result of this move?
Congressman, I don't have that information. I do know that there has been an extraordinarily concerted effort on behalf by the Bureau of Land Management to ensure that no persons lost their job. To my knowledge, only 1 or 2 people left as of now, as of today, are still being worked with for positions. But it has been a very significant effort. And with respect to Congress, it is my understanding, and again, I can certainly go back to the head of Bureau of Land Management, but that the Congressional Liaison Office will remain here in Washington for the purposes you described, which is that they can better communicate with Congress on all these important matters, so they will not be relocated west, is my understanding.
So, thank you. And it's my understanding that 80 staff out of the 170 have already left as of January 23rd. Do you know how many of these employees who have left were senior level staffers?
No, I do not, but I do know that a lot of them are still within the department. There was a very strong effort made starting several months ago that asked all of the other offices, and I'm one of them, asked all of us to be sure to hire BLM staffers who were not interested in moving west. I, in fact, was lucky enough
I appreciate that.
to get one of those great people.
The committee has found that much of the diversity in the BLM workforce can be found in the National Capital Region office. Roughly 41% of Black or African-American BLM employees were located in the District of Columbia office before the relocation began. Of the staff who have left so far, do you know how many are African-American?
No, I do not, but I can.
And I would certainly commend that you look into that because, you know, diversity, and as you even suggested in your response to the last question, diversity in the workforce, diversity inclusion is important. So I think it's important that we always measure and consider the impact on diversity and inclusion when we're making decisions like this. So perhaps my final question here, what are you doing to ensure that BLM relocation does not result in a loss of diversity?
We're not seeing any loss in diversity within the department or within BLM, as far as I know, but I will certainly get back to you with some information.
Great, I appreciate that. Thank you, Ms. Chairman. I'll yield back, balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Madam Secretary, thank you very much for being here, providing testimony. I appreciate it very much. Having said that, I do would like to express my disappointment and that despite that we notified you and your staff, some of your staff, about several issues that maybe will be brought up in the hearing by other members, like the appropriate level of analysis for the relocation or reorganization of an agency. Is the document production complete for the request associated with the BLM relocation, aside from the in-camera documents that the chair and ranking Republican requested? Funding spent on the border wall, Department of Interior's document productions to the committee in paper rather than electronic form, proposed budget cuts to the Office of Insular Affairs, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, and solicitor's memo issue. You still were not able to provide answers. And at this point, I'm just curious, I'm really curious, how many, so we have some kind of agreement, how many questions did you said that you would take and come back to Congress, to this committee, with answers?
I will defer to my note takers back
please,
here
no,
because
please,
my memory's not so hot.
No, neither is mine, but please, just so we have some general agreement. How many?
So we haven't had time to add them up, but I know we've been taking notes. I don't have a number, sir, for you.
Okay, but you did take quite a few. And the members of the committee may have some additional questions for you, Madam Secretary, for you, and we'll ask you to respond to this in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing, and the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you again, Madam Secretary. I mean that. Thank you very much for being here. I don't know how you got drafted or you volunteered, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman.